Well, maybe not. Maybe we should just get started. So thanks everybody again for joining today. And this is an informal session. It doesn't have to take the whole hour, but it's a good opportunity in early May to see how things have developed since the beginning of the new year. What sort of new knowledge graph trends are we seeing? What good speakers have we heard from? I know, Steve, you're in the process of building an agenda for 2022 for the DCAF, the forum that Semantic Arts holds every year. And maybe you just like to put some feelers out.
Yeah, I'd say that's exactly what I'm doing, is just trying to understand what topics are out there, what speakers are starting to, gravitate into some different areas. And of course, we're always trying to keep things as practical as possible. So those, organizations that are moving the needle in that direction tend to be the ones that we'd like to attract to DCAF and start to continue to foster that message that this is achievable. This is something that organizations are doing, and so I think we got a good start. But it's always good to get more on the bandwagon.
Absolutely. And any thoughts about how the DCAF is going to evolve over the next 6 or 7 months before you have an agenda in place?
We haven't had a chance to get together as a team. So right now, I think that we are going to be probably, putting together a virtual as well as a face-to-face, some type of a hybrid structure, because it will be in February again. So we're still sorting through some of that. And as we know, in these times, being nimble and adjusting is part of the package.
Exactly. So if folks have ideas for Steve or speaker leads or things that might be useful in enriching the content of a future event, just please reach out to him. So I thought maybe I could just start with my own observations on what I've seen over the past few months. And in general, there have been any number of conferences that I didn't get a chance to attend, being busy as we all are. So Connected Data London is one of those events. I'm sure there are things like the International Semantic Web Conference, the more academic events that I haven't heard about. But I did have a chance to lead a workshop at the Knowledge Graph Conference on Monday, and that conference is continuing, and they've got 70 speakers. They really have sort of rounded up all the usual suspects and then some to speak. So if you want an update from somebody you know, or if you want some refreshing insight from somebody you don't know, it probably is in that group of speakers somewhere. So it's a lot to paw through and see what's new and relevant.
What's the name of the conference, Alan?
It's the KGC 2021 Knowledge Graph Conference 2021. It's sort of here in the U.S. in the sense that it's virtual, but it's Eastern time, Ram. And are you in Arizona? I can't remember where you are, but
I'm in LA. Los Angeles.
Los Angeles. So pretty early for us to get up in the morning at 6 o'clock and listen to talks. But that's what I did on Monday. And just to give you a brief overview of the personal knowledge graph space as we're seeing right now, we had a number of speakers talking about what they were doing with the beginnings of personal knowledge graphs. And the thought here is that we've got a bunch of enterprise folks who've been working for years and years on developing a semblance of momentum in the knowledge graph space. So how can we encourage adoption? How can we get people to use use models better in in their work. And so the thought is, if we can get some consumer platforms out there that get people in the habit of working with models in a simple way and sort of a data-centric approach, if you will, with what they're doing every day, then it seems like that would benefit the enterprise. So we've had this working group stood up for over a year now that Semantic Arts has sponsored. And you know, that we had a couple of people presenting at the workshop who are doing some really interesting things. For example, Ivo Velichkov, you may know him from the European theater. He's written quite a bit. He wrote an organization book called Essential Balances, but he blogs a lot on the semantics topics in particular. And Ivo has been working with Rome for a year or so. And if you're not familiar with Rome research, it's a networked note-taking kind of tool. It's an advance over the Evernotes of the world. And so you're able to take advantage of simple bidirectional links and graph visualization of how things are linked together with Rome. And they're using Markdown for that purpose. But Evo's been looking at this from a semantics perspective and how to add semantics to the note-taking. So imagine use cases where you've got your own personal repositories and you want to make sure that those repositories are more discoverable. And so you're adding links like in Rome, these bidirectional links. And so you can actually add links to each paragraph or each word even. You can make it as granular as you'd like to. And so let's say you're a cook and you're trying to try some new recipes out, and you've got some recipes in your notes. And you can link these blocks together. And all of a sudden, there's a little bit of capability that just has to do with being able to pull up what's in another note into a recipe note that you've just created. So you can track, for example, how much of an ingredient you need to buy at the store. So it's that kind of simple thing that Rome is enabling. And Evo's been building on top of that stuff. And so basically what he's done is take what he knows from the formal semantics world and just sort of do a hack in Rome. And so I can share out that presentation if folks are interested. I have to get the link from him. So that was one little element. We also had signed up the CEO of Rome Research, Connor White Sullivan, and he got confused about the time, or he just didn't have the ability to join us. But basically, he's built this huge community with his team. So you can imagine that there are all sorts of subgroups in this community that focus on things like productivity, for example. If they're fans of the getting things done approach, the David Allen approach to project management or daily management of what you want to have done by the end of the week. So all that stuff is being Romified in these communities. And so we've sort of talked about 3 or 4 different use cases in the personal knowledge graph space. And another one that I'd mention is decentralized security in the sense of having your own repository, controlling your own personally identifiable information, trying to make sure that those correlatable identifiers are not shared. They don't necessarily have to be in order to verify credentials. So that's the next generation of so-called self-sovereign identity. And the Solid project is behind that stuff. So we had a speaker from the working group, Chu Nodu, who has a background in GIS systems, geographic information systems, and he was just curious about the knowledge graph approach. So he taught himself how to put together an application on top of Solid. And so he was talking about that. And he was talking about all the different layers that he was using to create his little environment. And then we had Brian Rubenton to end up things, who has a product called Canopy.io. And Canopy is like networked note taking along the lines of Roam, but it really starts with RDF. So you've got the visualization of the RDF graph that you're just adding nodes to, for example, and you've got different views in Canopy depending on what kind of view you'd like. So, for example, if you just want your node editor in the middle and you want the links that are related on the sides, you can view it that way. It's probably the most advanced platform I've seen that really could be classified as a personal knowledge graph. Now, that being said, Chris has also been working on his Lascivus project. And Chris, I don't know if you have the update for others on what you've been doing with Lascivus.
So with Lascivus, I haven't been doing anything, unfortunately, quite as exciting as the things you've been described. What I'm doing is building an information platform that I hope will be user accessible. So, for example, I'm doing things like, instead of assuming people know Markdown, trying to incorporate a WYSIWYG type way of building information so that people can build web pages. And the underlying technology for it is a triple store. The interesting thing that I've been taking out of some of the stuff that you've been describing there is how knowledge graphs might fit in with this, and they fit in. They can fit in quite a lot of ways, but the particular way that came out of that last meeting was the role of the knowledge graph in mediating between the information and the presentation. And I think, for example, if you look at how knowledge graphs are used in Alexa, for example, they mediate between the information base and the way that the information is presented. In that case, it's presented in audio form. But in the sense of information that's presented in more traditional, if you like, textual or numeric form, I think there's still an interesting role for the knowledge graph to determine what kind of view of information you're going to get. And for a personal knowledge graph, you're looking at personalizing the view that you're going to get of the information, which is kind of very interesting in an abstract sense. I just wish I had a practical instantiation of it at this point.
No, it's a really good thread of discussion that we could generate on that basis, Chris. I think in general, our working group is struggling on the user experience side of things. We've got quite a few people who are very familiar with backends, and the front end maybe. Greg, you're probably struggling with this as well. How do you develop a usable, easy to use front end for what you're trying to take advantage of? So we did have some people reaching out after the workshop who are more versed in the user experience area, and I'm hoping to have some of them on the call at some point, see what they're up to. But some exciting things happening that we managed to find out about, and we've got some momentum with the working group that we're going to try to develop a few work streams and see where we can go over the next 6 months. So we'll be doing some planning during our working group session. And, I mentioned use cases for personal knowledge graphs. Of course, a lot of the folks in the working group have an interest in research and do a lot of tracking of development methods and trends. And so the research use case is pretty central. A lot of the folks who are into these network note-taking kinds of systems are very organized. They're sort of squirreling away information in some way or another, and they're looking for a better means of doing that and being able to retrieve it, and the serendipity of having things all together in one virtual space. So there are other use cases besides the ones that I've mentioned. And it's also exciting to think about what's in the realm of the possible in terms of multimedia management, for example. So, we're just trying to do a simple version of a minimum viable product to get out there to see if we can get some interest in what we're coming up with. And we've got several leads now. So that was that workshop. And I had the opportunity to dive into a couple of other workshops on Monday. One of them was healthcare personal data oriented. And that's one I didn't have a chance to sit in on for long, but there was just a ton of speakers talking about this stuff. And one of the other trends I picked up on was the fact that symbolic methods, knowledge representation methods, for example, are coming together with the statistical machine learning methods. There has been quite a bit of activity along those fronts. And so whereas we had these separate tribes, the KR tribe, the symbolists in one silo, essentially, working on their own. And then we had the statistical machine learning people working as data scientists and what have you on the other side. And the two groups weren't talking. Now we've got a lot of data scientists who are in the knowledge graph realm. And Ben, I don't know if that you've seen this at AstraZeneca or other companies. Is this
starting?
Yeah.
Starting, Alan. You're right. They're a bit oil and water, the two groups, but they're starting to recognise that, well, the knowledge representation people are recognising there is at least some value in the stuff that the data scientists do, and the data scientists are realising actually a computer algorithm doesn't solve everything, particularly where you don't have large data sets, which is most of the time.
Exactly. So the two groups are certainly complementary. They may not know it, but they're starting to realize to some extent. Ram, you have a comment about this?
Yeah. So in some group, I forget where it is, that I heard also about knowledge graph of knowledge graphs within the pharma research side that they were looking at and understanding how you can do privacy preserving models, and then how do you have these models exchange information across. That's another theme that is coming up in this industry.
So do you want to elaborate on that a bit so we understand better?
So it's essentially models. When you generate machine learning models, you have a lot of data, and then the data needs to be updated on a regular basis. And then you also have this privacy information within the data. How do you share the learning from those models without having to share the privacy information? How do you preserve the privacy while it allows you to develop and generate the models, and the learnings coming out of that model and the insights coming out of the model that can be federated across all the users? That's one of the concepts that I heard recently.
Yeah. It seems like those who are database savvy might be aware of methods that aren't generally used as much as they could be in that respect. I mean, the more granular you get, the more control you have, I would assume.
Probably Ben might be aware of it. Ben, are you familiar with that?
I'm just trying to think what Jans Asselman refers to them as in his is it triple annotations or something like that.
Yeah, it's a triple level security.
Yeah.
Cell level security. Accumulo, for example, has cell level security.
We looked at Oracle's advanced security at their cell level stuff. Pretty horrible, but You know, it's those sorts of challenges of, yeah, how do you let people traverse a graph where they might not have permission to access a node, but they don't care about the information in the node? Those are the real questions that start to come up.
Yeah, and it's not only so the idea here is not only you share the information within the organization, but you share across, you know, the partner organizations.
Yeah.
In the sense, you all have the trust within that data, but you are not actually bringing the privacy information out, and you're able to generate the learnings from the models and exchange that learnings, the
Yeah,
information on the
I saw a talk recently on that, looking at a
yeah.
blockchain solution around that,
Yes.
around healthcare
Yes.
data.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'd like to see Solid used in that space. That seems, you know, there's been some good healthcare examples there with Solid being used as the backbone. So, yeah, the use cases are coming up, right?
Yeah, that's what I thought. There are some themes going on in healthcare and pharma space for that. Because healthcare is pretty prime for that exchange of information because of COVID. There's so much of data being exchanged, and the privacy needs to be preserved. And there's a lot of momentum going on.
Alan,
So,
I think you're familiar with the Flurry products, and they're sort of trying to secure data more at the node level. Would their solutions be relevant to some of these data security and sort of visibility?
They're so much more elegant than what I've seen from Ethereum, for example. So if you're talking about control ROM and want to put smart contracts in the mix, that's a novel way to do it. But in general, it seems like there's all this complexity that you just mentioned, Ram, that we have to address. But in order to be able to address it, enterprises need to get the complexity out of the monoliths that they've created. So that goes back to the software wasteland mandate, which is you got to reduce the complexity that you have before you can actually move forward and take advantage of all the the partner level stuff that we need to put together to have the supply chain that's visible, and interactive. So thanks for those comments, guys. Boris, you had your hand up.
Right. There were a couple of things mentioned. One of them, we're talking about the securing the graph and then looking at permissions and private versus public portions of the graph. There's some developments on that front. Interesting that you mentioned Accumulo a few years ago. I was involved in the development of RIA, which has just emerged from the Apache incubator, which is a triple store built on top of Accumulo, specifically being used for military intelligence because you can have individual rules for cell level security there. So that's something that, and Stardog has recently made some advances on moving beyond named graph-based permissions and into being able to secure data with more precision, with one of the more interesting innovations being that if you need something like a URI to join across, but you shouldn't have the permission to see what it actually is, let's say something like joining across an SSN but not knowing the SSN, it will generate a repeatable value for you as you access it, so you can join across it, an obscured, like a hashed value of the actual thing, so that you can do joins across it but not see the social security number. And so there's some interesting developments there. But the first one was the integration between data science and knowledge graphs. I actually participated at KGC. There was a data science on the graph working group, and they were using RDF-Lib to pull data out of graphs, and then, because it's all Python, using PyTorch and TensorFlow to feed data model training and do some machine learning based on graph data. With the other aspect that's not quite being considered right now is, once your machine learning model has generated some conclusions, designing the data model into which to store it, and which is it's a pathway on the flip side of that particular process. So those are the sort of, so the communities are starting to mix. They're not quite as disjoint as they once were, and so I think there's promise in that area.
Yeah, and more to what you were talking about with moving the observations, the findings, into the model. Boris, I'm thinking that there's an abstraction capability that's inherent in the RDF stack, that if you're trying to generalize, for example, and your machine learning model is just specifically trained on X, and you want X, Y, and Z in the mix, the model's a means for that, I'm assuming.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can definitely. I think that there is knowledge lost when the output of your learning model, if you're classifying things, is just yet another stack of tabular data. If you go from one big file on S3 to a slightly smaller file on S3 with the conclusions of what you have learned. And I think if you because some of the data that was implied when you were doing the either training or running the model kind of gets lost if you output it into another block of non-semantically annotated data. So if you capture the semantics that are part of your machine learning model running and output it as a semantic model, I think you're much more likely to have the results both discovered and used in the appropriate manner.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for that, Boris. Tim, you had your hand up as well.
Yes, and this is Tim Smith with Procter & Gamble. And I wanted to share some thoughts that we've been mulling around now for quite some time and have failed to actually achieve around kind of the personal knowledge graph and integrating knowledge graphs kind of into our daily work. And for us, we believe that the use case really starts with our knowledge graphs and our daily tools, whether they're engineering tools or R&D tools or just simple, Office 365 types of environments. Really need to, first, they need to understand who we are and what our role is in the organization. And the reason for that is that enables you to record these little bit of pieces of information, learnings that you have in the appropriate context. So it knows that I'm going to have a project meeting this afternoon with this project team. It knows what that's about. It knows all of the key players as well as the key entities. And it can record information right into that context, which immediately makes it discoverable. That's kind of one of our goals. But to do that, I really have to make my tooling that everybody lives in, which for us, aside from domain-specific tooling like our engineering tool sets and things like that, it's largely Office 365. So it's Teams, it's all Word and Excel and SharePoint and all that sort of stuff. And those tools, and Microsoft in particular, doesn't seem to be very interested in any kind of knowledge graph awareness in their tool set. I even had a discussion with their common data model team. It's Microsoft CDM. You can look it up. And they've created a lot of domain models, and they were adamant that they would never move those models out of an Irwin-based modeling context because corporations don't want to see anything but entity relationship diagrams. It was very disappointing to actually have that conversation with them. But so one of the things we're looking for is like, how do I build this awareness into my tools? Because I think when you do that, and then you layer on an upper ontology that begins to support generalization of a lot of the things you're learning, whether it's hardcore science and engineering or consumer insights or products research, whatever it may be, you really begin to lay the foundation for making connections in that kind of serendipitous discovery and auto-connecting information, especially in a global multinational like us. We're about 100,000 people around the globe, spread across, I don't know how many countries anymore or how many locations. In the era of COVID, we're probably in nearly 100,000 locations, counting our homes as a location. But the point is if you do have that automated context and generalization, then you can make that connection and make it seem as though the person's living next to you in the cube in the office, even though they might be halfway around the globe, bringing an awareness what people are doing. And I've not been successful where our IT department is, they consider themselves top notch. I consider themselves operating around the year 2000, because that's really the technology viewpoint that they have, which is unfortunate. But anyway, that's what I wanted to share.
No, it's a really good point, Tim, and I know Microsoft came out with Viva recently, and they're probably pestering you about trying it out. Given that P&G is such a big 365 house.
Mm-hmm.
Have you had a look at Viva? And it's supposed to solve some of the problems that you mentioned, but I understand it doesn't go very far. It's an evolution of SharePoint, et cetera.
I have not had a chance to look at it yet. The name came across my way a little while ago, but that's as far as I've gotten.
Alan, did you say Viva?
Yeah, Viva, VIVA. I put a link in the chat for those that want to take a look. There's a video and some other things.
There's another product called Viva that is VEEVA. That's for document management, and they're into the clinical space and doing a lot of.
Yeah, we're a client.
Yeah.
Customer.
Yeah, we're a client as well of the VEEVA, Viva.
Well, this is confusing at a minimum.
Yes.
And adding another application complexity to what already exists. So lots of challenges here. Any other comments about conferences you all have attended? Any recent trends you've seen? Speakers that were particularly interesting? Anybody?
I'm still living off the back of I think it's Dan Gershwin from Amgen at DCAF, his presentation.
Yeah, Dan Schwind.
Yeah.
Yeah, at Amgen.
Yeah, with his honeycomb motif.
I think
stolen that, and it's resonated immensely well internally.
Yes, that's breaking some barriers for me, or broken some barriers for me internally as well.
A lot of people like that honeycomb diagram, and just that alone, what does that do for people, Ben?
I think it's allowed me to talk about knowledge graphs without all the complexity of nodes and edges and things. People can just see the idea of concepts, and the honeycomb seems to speak to gaps, and they can immediately see the idea of filling those in with more information, and it just expanding.
Yeah.
And it just seems to resonate with them in ways. I don't know. I tried some testing with people with using circles instead of hexagons and squares and triangles and things, and the response to the hexagons was just off the scale.
What?
Same image with its circles just didn't work.
Can Tim, maybe you can describe the honeycomb for us, so people who haven't seen Dan's presentation can understand.
Yeah, so basically, we tend to think in knowledge graphs and all of the interconnected edges and nodes and things. And what Dan did is he created a honeycomb appearance and put the big knowledge domains in kind of in the center, and you could drill into them if you wanted to see the details and get to the nodes and the edges. But it was really like, okay, I've got these core knowledge domains, and I don't recall what his were for Amgen, some things like patient and study and that sort of stuff. And then as you went out from the center into the different honeycomb pieces, you quickly saw the related domains, and they were arranged as to how tightly coupled they were. Yeah, there we go.
Oh,
Perfect.
super. Thank you. Yeah. And so what was the reaction internally to the honeycomb that you were borrowing, Tim?
I think it let people see. So I was kind of proposing the data fabric concept, and I had been trying to talk it up internally for a while. And then I happened upon this presentation as part of the data-centric forum, and I was like, oh, this is a great visual aid to kind of helping people understand what do you mean by fabric? Why do I care? And so the honeycomb really gave a sense of it kind of looks like a fabric, right? You could lay it down as a blanket. It looks like a quilt. And So it gave people a good visual feeling for how things are connected, and it gave me a place to start to say, hey, look, we have just one of our data hubs, and we have dozens of these. One of them has 200,000 columns across 2,500 tables in it. There is no single person that can describe anywhere close to the entire model of all that information. And so it gave me a way to say, look, if you know this data domain, wouldn't you like to know where that data actually sits and then how to use it? Wouldn't you want to start at this business context level and drill into it? And so it's enabled me to have that conversation in a way that isn't starting from ground zero. So it was a great leg up.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And there were a number of presentations I didn't get to see that were on data meshes. And if you follow folks like Juan Cicada in the semantics community, he's been plugged into data meshes. That's a concept that the folks at ThoughtWorks have come up with. ThoughtWorks being a development-oriented consultancy that looks at trends. And so I know that Semantic Arts has looked at data meshes a bit. Anybody want to comment on the data mesh versus the knowledge graph and what seems to be happening in that space? Because it's, as far as I understand, it's not semantically oriented, at least not yet.
Well, the mesh for me is the semantic layer we all talk about. When I heard it and I put my interpretation on it, the thing I liked was the idea that products are a first-class citizen. So data is a product and a first-class citizen, and it's that investment in creating that. So we're talking about creating fair data products out of our data born fair. And we're talking about those fair data products being created with URIs in. So then the next logical piece is, well, we just put a graph over the top of it, right? Yep. So that's the journey, and that's how it fits in. And I saw mesh and thought, well, this is just semantic web, right? It's what's the difference here? But
it should be in terms of unique identifiers and semantic models and such. Marcel, you've got your hand up. You want to comment on this?
So I think the difference is the data mesh people is basically coming from a different lineage. It's the API people. The API people discovering, oh, there is not only API, there is probably also like data that we need to share independent of our APIs. What it has in common, it has a very strong domain orientation. I think domain orientation in segmenting businesses and IT is not a new idea. They're very agnostic to how data is formatted or what kind of data technology is used. They basically only acknowledge, well, you have your domain, and the domain has kind of a boundary, and on the boundary you're not only having APIs as we looked at it before, as they looked at it before, but there are also something that they call data product. And this is basically just a way to say, well, here's the data sets and here's the models of our domain. So that's from the semantics perspective, what we're saying that there should be. They're not referring to knowledge graphs, but it's highly compatible if you want to look at it like that.
Yeah, and Marcel, it's what I'm wondering is if data mesh is going to become a popular term of art. We tend to be the tail wagging the dog in terms of our community versus the much larger data science quote unquote community. What's your take on data mesh in terms of just trying to get people interested in what we're up to versus knowledge graph? Is there any advantage to using the term data mesh, or should we put it in our SEO quiver? How would you approach it?
Data mesh people, if you talk to data mesh people about semantics, some of them get, well, not angry, but definitely pushing back. Because to them, they say, oh, yeah, this is this stuff about virtualization. Yeah, I've seen virtualization before. It's crap. We don't need this. They don't really interacted much with what we have on offer, because we're not primarily about virtualization, are we? So there is a lot of explaining to do, and it's probably worthwhile, like from a CEO perspective, to get involved in these discussions, because it just seems to resonate with developers. Most of the developer world has been thinking API for dozens of years. So they discover this other aspect now, and everybody's flocking to this data mesh concept because this is what is there and what people talk about. So it seems to resonate with a lot of IT people. So there is an opportunity to talk about both, not to say, well, this is what I've been saying all the time, because they're saying something different, but making clear where sort of the overlap is and what we have to add on top of that, because we obviously have to add or offer a lot on top of what data mesh says in terms of specifying how those models could be structured and what you can win on top, if it's not just a table that you're exposing as a data product, but something that has an explicit model and is a graph.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I'm wondering, since we've talked about the honeycomb, and we could sort of characterize the honeycomb with Dan's permission as a kind of a mesh, and we could say, hey, here's our semantic data mesh. I've just thinking in marketing terms. I'm not talking with a bunch of marketers today, but Steve, I don't know what your thoughts are about such a thing.
Yep, I resemble that category. Actually, what I've attempted to do, and this is still preliminary, is to try and use data mesh as a conversation pivot point. So again, as everyone's alluded to, is that the IT organizations catch on to these new terms, and certainly it's a data fabric, data mesh. What's the next one that's going to come along here? So it just entices them to look at it, and then they can talk about it, and then you bring in semantic capabilities that can basically outperform what they're doing at that level, and hopefully they are able to turn their heads or turn their mindsets into a different way of thinking, and then they're like, that's interesting, and then you can spin a little bit further towards more of that semantic layer and say, this is how it's fitting into your bigger data ecosystem.
Yeah.
But one of the nice things in mesh is it's exactly that, moving beyond the monolith and accepting that not all data has to exist in the same lake instance. And then you get to the question of, well, I've got fragments of information across my different instances. How do I bring that together? And that's been the pivot for me, in that the data mesh conversation and the people that championed that broke the monolithic lake. And now I said, well, now you need to join the data across all these sources. So now we need this knowledge layer that sits above it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Makes sense. Anything we can do to sort of bring that kind of message home.
So I think one of the interesting things about the data mesh is the governance aspect, that because you have the data products, you have a federated governance model, and that would allow you to extend your mesh beyond the bounds of a single enterprise, which could be important, I think. But the semantic web standards have always had a federated basis. So they're actually a very natural fit for a semantic layer on top of the data mesh layer. I mean, my understanding of the way most data meshes go is that they're sort of ODBC based for connectivity, and they have some kind of common typing provisions, but they typically go up to a semantic layer above that.
Absolutely, Chris. And I'm wondering, speaking of governance across organizational boundaries, if you could have in your honeycomb scheme, you could have cells that are basically superpower cells that have the ability to do that boundary crossing. And from a governance perspective, they may have extra permissions that other kinds of cells don't, given that they've proven their worth in terms of management and governance of what's inside that cell. So it seems like you could do a cell-by-cell governance approach with this.
Right. Well, I mean, if each cell corresponds to a product, then and some of those aspects of is it a good product will come into some of those things you were talking about of do you trust it to go across a boundary.
Yeah.
An organization will accept a data product as a good data product that it can use and can do business with its owner, as it were. And I suspect that can be the basis of collaboration between enterprises, and probably maybe industry bodies will provide some of these cross-enterprise cells that can be or products that the enterprises in their industries can then use in their meshes.
Absolutely. We've got some folks on the call who are in the big supply chain kind of business, whether it's pharma or consumer products or what have you. Any thoughts on supply chain management trends that sort of lead themselves in this direction? Anything happening that we could latch on to? Ben or Tim or others?
So I'm in the R&D space, so
yeah.
Our problems lie like when we buy a product from another pharma company and how do we bring the data in? That's where our drivers are going to be around standards, so that we can just have a minimal viable product in terms of data package.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So there's a data product that goes with the physical product.
Well, when you buy the product, you also buy all the data that was generated to support it, because you'll need it for future filings.
Right.
But it was inevitably generated in a system that wasn't yours and isn't the same, right? So how do you deal with this stuff?
You need that layer, right? You need that semantic layer with federation on top.
Yeah. There's within pharma, we have something called the Pistoia Alliance, because it was set up at a town called Pistoia in Italy, and it's about pre-competitive collaboration in the pharma industry across vendors and the industry, the research organisations. And one of the streams in there is we're looking at how do we create fair data. There's a fair data cookbook. We're looking at fair clinical trials and what that means, and we're working with the likes of FHIR and HL7 and those sorts of groups as well to try and accept that none of us can do it ourselves, but as a group maybe we can get to some sort of agreement.
Right. I mean, I think the medical side of things generally has a huge background in semantics and semantic work. I've probably done more than any other industry I can think of.
Well, life sciences has a big problem with language, right, and naming conventions and things, and they were forced down that route because it's more words than chemistry and physics, if you like. So
I think life sciences has been pursuing probably knowledge management starting from early 90s that I know of. There were publications from what is called Economic Times. They've produced a book actually on knowledge management in pharma industry. That's way back in early 90s. And if any of you have seen that it's a special edition from Economic Times.
Well, we were lucky enough, I think, in life sciences to have the European enterprise now invest in things like the European Bioinformatics Institute, and therefore that produced enough of a critical mass to start creating these shared data resources and things. So
yeah.
And it's When P&G had a pharmaceutical division for about 20 years, we divested ourselves of it in 2009, but I did spend 10 years in the research function. And that's where I first started using ontologies and graphs back in the mid to late 90s. Wasn't much there technology-wise, but the concept was sound because we were doing a lot of bioinformatics, sewing together a lot of public databases that are now sewn together for us. But now I am in the manufacturing space and have been for the last 6, 7 years. And so people are starting to realize that you are now able to capture an immense amount of data coming off of your production lines in real time even, and making sense of that information, especially when you have diverse environment with all sorts of vendors and different hardware, Rockwell and Siemens and all of the other controller manufacturers. If they make it, we probably have at least one somewhere on the planet. You mentioned acquisitions. You buy a company, you've got their infrastructure to integrate as well, and people are starting to understand that you need to have some frameworks in which you can bring this stuff together, as well as this kind of point-to-point wiring of connecting things makes spaghetti out of your IT infrastructure. And so that's one of the methods I've been pushing. The data fabric approach is like, hey, if you create a model that you standardize and you map everything to the same language, you now have a common language. You only have to map into that. You have to translate it one way, and then you can translate it from there back out if you need to share things. And that concept resonates with some people, not the entity relationship diagram people, though they still refuse to come out of their shells. I did post a link into the chat to an organization called SESME, and it's a Smart Manufacturing Institute, and they're doing some work around creating what they call smart manufacturing profiles. I'm trying to influence them to push them more in the RDF direction, but there's a lot of bad blood, if you will, around RDF and triple stores being non-performant and so on. And so I'm finding a bit of resistance in a number of different professional organizations. But these folks are working to essentially develop standardized data models, to use their term, or smart profiles of entities that are generated and come out of controllers, programmable logic controllers on manufacturing lines, and getting cross-vendor standardization of those models. So when you have different events occur, or different transformations, or different kinds of equipment, the data model for a mixer, for example, or some sort of reactor vessel is all the same across vendors when you lift it out into your historians or your cloud environments. So there are some efforts going along in that direction, but it's going to take kind of a different mindset to really make that happen and make it flow. And then on the back end of that, you need analytics tools that actually take advantage of knowing the structure of the data, so consuming data from a data fabric. And unfortunately, our common analytics platforms like a Tableau or a Power BI or Spotfire and those sorts of things are still woefully inadequate as far as leveraging a knowledge graph. They still want to see tables and columns. And so I know vendors like Stardog will help you create a tabular representation of a slice of their data fabric. But it doesn't really help my users so much because they're still having to think in terms of tables and columns and not business concepts and relationships. And so I'd be very excited to hear of any vendors who are building analytics capability on top of a knowledge graph framework.
Yeah, and Moham, I don't know if you want to comment on that side of things. I know that's a specialty of what relational AI has been up to.
Unfortunately, Alan, I was distracted with something, so I wasn't paying attention to the last 5 minutes. So sorry about that. What's the topic? Is there one sentence?
Well, I think that Tim has been struggling with the deficiencies of triple stores over the years, and also visualization of certain elements in an analytics context that help with getting beyond the tabular representations, for example, and just having access to those things in a connected way. Is that a fair restatement of what you were talking about, Tim?
Yes, and I would just add one other wiggle on that would be enabling users of analytics tools to formulate their queries of that environment based on an ontological representation instead of tables and columns and joins, because it just simply lowers the threshold to the user, the amount of technical understanding that they need to have. Going back to the 200,000 columns across 2,500 tables, if I can eliminate them from having to deal with that, but they can just say, I want all products that were manufactured in these countries, sold in those countries in the last 6 months, that kind of query interface would be much more useful to a broader swath of our employees.
Yeah, I really agree with that, Tim. So the name of our company is Relational AI. So this idea of relational knowledge graph management systems. So we're a minute over our time already, so I can't really give you anything deep, but would love to connect on that, or maybe for the next month's meeting, maybe we can talk about that or structure a small presentation. In fact, what I was being distracted with is one of my colleagues is giving a talk later today at the Stanford Knowledge Graph Seminar. I don't know if you're aware of that. It's freely available. You'll be giving a talk at, there are 2 speakers that start at 4:30 Pacific today, so staying with the theme of conferences. It's a Stanford, look up Stanford Knowledge Graph Seminar, you'll find it. And he will be talking about the specific topic of how do you provide the relational abstraction and like, the best of the relational model and the graph model, and how you use like highly normalized relational schema to kind of get the best of both worlds. So happy to talk offline about it some more.
And that those are recorded, by the way, folks. So if you could just register at, I think it's CS 520 is the course number on the Stanford site.
I'm gonna paste the link here.
Yeah.
So that everyone sees it. It's open to the public. It's every week. Vinay gives a lecture on Tuesdays, just covering background material to the students, and on Thursdays he gets 2 guest speakers. And one of the 2 guest speakers today is Martin Bravenboer, who's my colleague, and he'll be talking exactly about this topic.
Super appreciate that lead, and in general, that's a great source for folks to catch up on what's happening in knowledge graphs, and it's free. So without further ado, I know we're past our time. Any other comments before we close off today? Anything else we should be aware of before we sign off?
I do have a small comment on Tim Smith's comment here. Tim, my name is Prasad. I worked for Amgen for 20 years before I came to Accenture. And I can relate to what you're saying because I worked on that manufacturing side of the data that you are currently working on several years ago, and bringing all of different types of historian data and mixing and matching up with all the LIMS data and the different ELN data, and then putting all that together into that dance type, the Honeycomb, and that is the type of work that I have done before. And I can completely relate with you how, where you're coming and how you're seeing. I would love to have a conversation with you offline if possible.
Yeah, that would be great.
So Tim, I'll try to connect you to the folks that have offered help, and appreciate the comments from everyone today. The participation has been wonderful, and thanks for all the good sharing that's been going on.
Thanks for hosting.
Thanks for hosting.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Helen, thanks for hosting.
Okay, we'll see you next time, I hope. Bye-bye now.
Bye.